In the last general election, INEC declared results before collation was complete in at least 7 states, not alleged, documented, and yet not a single electoral official has faced criminal prosecution. So when Peter Obi steps to the microphone and says, "We will count the votes ourselves in 2027, the question is not whether he is angry, the question is whether he is right. And if he is right, what does it mean that he's saying it now, 2.5 years before the election? Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Niger Insight Desk exists for one reason, to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now because this conversation is about to get deeper. Here is what actually happened. Peter Obi, NDC presidential candidate and the man who, by many independent assessments, won the popular vote in the Lagos-Abuja corridor in 2023, made a public declaration, pointed, unambiguous and deliberately timed. He said his party would deploy parallel vote collation in 2027, their own agents, their own data, their own numbers. He said this not at a rally, not in a moment of passion. He said it in a structured public address, which tells you everything about the intent. This was not an outburst. This was a statement of strategy. Now, why now? Because 2027 mobilization has already begun. APC is restructuring its state-level machinery, PDP is quietly courting defectors, and NDC, fresh from the bruising of 2023, knows it cannot afford to arrive unprepared at another election cycle and then litigate its losses in court for 2 years after the fact. The timing is not accidental, the message is not emotional, it is architectural. Let us be precise about what we are dealing with. INEC, the Independent Electoral Commission, is constitutionally mandated under Section 153 and the third schedule of the 1999 Constitution to conduct, supervise, and collate elections. That authority is not shared, it is not delegated to political parties, and it is certainly not transferred to individual candidates. But here is where it gets more complicated. The Electoral Act 2022, widely praised as a reform instrument, introduced BVAS, the Bimodal Voter Accreditation System, and mandated real-time upload of results to the iRev portal. The law exists, the technology was deployed, and in 2023, multiple tribunal judgments acknowledged that result sheets uploaded to iRev contradicted declared results in specific polling units. That is not Obi's allegation, that is the tribunal record. So the institutional question is not whether INEC has legal authority. It does. The question is whether that authority has been exercised with fidelity to the law it operates under. And that question, as of today, remains open. When Obi says NCD will count votes themselves, he is not proposing a constitutional alternative to INEC. He is describing robust parallel tracking, the kind that INEC's own legal framework permits, through accredited party agents. What he is signaling is that in 2027, NCD intends to be so granular, so present at the ward level, that any deviation from the documented result becomes immediately visible and immediately actionable. That is not an attack on democratic institutions. That is arguably how democratic institutions are supposed to be held accountable. The more uncomfortable question, and I want you to hold this, is why a major party needs to say that publicly in 2026. We will return to that. Now, if what you just heard challenged what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this before we get to the part that reframes everything. Let us talk about who gains and who loses from this declaration, because that map tells you more than the statement itself. NCD gains visibility. In the current political landscape, Labour has struggled to maintain the energy of the 2023 obedient movement. Funding is constrained. Structural party machinery, the ward-level apparatus that wins Nigerian elections, remains thin outside the southeast. This statement costs nothing and generates national attention. It repositions Obi not as a grievant nursing a 2023 wound, but as a candidate already in campaign mode for 2027. The APC gains a narrative. Government-aligned voices will use this statement to paint Labour as adversarial to the electoral process, even though what Obi described is legally permitted. expect that framing to intensify. INEC is placed under early pressure, and that pressure, whether Obi intended it or not, may actually serve the institution. Commissions that know they are being watched tend to perform differently from those that believe scrutiny will arrive only after the fact. Now, who is conspicuously silent? PDP, the People's Democratic Party, which governed Nigeria for 16 years and which has its own long institutional relationship with INEC, has said almost nothing about this. Their silence is strategic. They do not want to be drawn into a debate about electoral integrity that implicates their own history. The presidency has not responded directly. That too is a choice. And here is the second-order consequence that most analysts are missing. Obi's statement is also a message to NCDs based in the diaspora, in London, Houston, Toronto, Johannesburg, who funded and mobilized the 2023 campaign and felt betrayed by what followed. He is telling them, we are not walking away. We are building the infrastructure to fight at a level the system cannot absorb. Here is where we must be honest about the ground-level stakes. Nigeria's democratic legitimacy crisis is not abstract, it is material. When citizens believe their votes don't count, when that belief is reinforced by tribunal findings, by documentation, by the testimony of people who are present in polling units, the resulting disengagement doesn't stay in the political column. It metastasizes. It affects investment climate. No serious portfolio investor prices Nigerian political risk without factoring in electoral instability. It affects federal-state relations. Governors who believe their mandates are manufactured, not earned, govern differently. They are less accountable downward to citizens and more accountable upward to whoever installed them. It affects security. Disenfranchisement and armed non-state actors are not separate phenomena in the Nigerian context. They exist on a spectrum. When legitimate political channels are perceived to be closed or corrupted, other channels fill the vacuum. And for the 40% of Nigerians living below poverty line, the people furthest from power, the people who queued for hours to vote in 2023, the question is brutally simple. Does my vote change anything about my life? If the answer is no, you don't just lose a voter, you lose a citizen. Obi's statement, whatever its strategic intent, touches that nerve, and that is why it resonated the way it did.
Nigeria is not an island. It is not even just a regional power. It is, for better or worse, the operating assumption of how African democracy functions at scale. ECOWAS has spent the last 3 years managing coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, and Gabon. In every case, the military stated justification included electoral corruption and governance failure. Nigeria is not immune to that narrative. It is, in fact, the country where that narrative would have the most catastrophic regional consequences if it ever found institutional expression. Foreign governments, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, all issued carefully worded statements after the 2023 election. None called it free and fair without qualification. That is diplomatic language for we have concerns, but we need Nigeria too much to say so directly. The diaspora, and I want to be specific here because they are part of this audience, understands the international dimension in a way that commentary inside Nigeria sometimes underestimates. They see how Nigeria is discussed in policy circles. They see the reporting. They know the gap between what Nigerian authorities say about the elections and what international observers document. Obi's statement lands differently in that context. It is not just domestic politics. It is Nigeria's democratic credibility in front of the world making a choice about whether to believe in itself. Let me steelman the strongest case against Obi's position because it deserves a serious answer, not a dismissal. The argument goes like this. Parallel vote collation by parties is fine in theory, but in a country with Labour's current structural weakness, announcing it in 2026 is more performance than preparation. You cannot count votes yourself at 120,000 polling units across 36 states without ward-level infrastructure, trained agents, secure data pipelines, and legal teams ready to move the moment discrepancies emerge. NDC, critics argue, does not yet have that, so the statement is bravado dressed as strategy. That is a legitimate critique, and it would be intellectually dishonest not to acknowledge it. But here's what that critique misses. Building infrastructure starts with a declaration of intent. You cannot recruit ward agents without a public commitment that the party is serious. You cannot attract the financial backing needed for that infrastructure without demonstrating that the leadership has the political will to deploy it. The statement is not the plan, it is the precondition for building the plan. The most common misconception circulating on social media is that Obi is calling for citizens to physically take over polling units. He is not. He is describing legal party agent deployment under the Electoral Act. Conflating the two is either careless or deliberate, and you should be skeptical of anyone doing it. What this conversation is really about, and what is being lost in the noise, is whether Nigeria has the institutional will to make the 2022 Electoral Act mean what it says. That is the real question. Obi's statement is, in that sense, a referendum on INEC's credibility before the election has even been called. Here are the three most likely next moves from the key actors, and I want you to watch for these specifically. First, INEC will issue a statement. It will be measured, it will reference the Commission's commitment to credible elections, and it will almost certainly not address the specific allegations embedded in Obi's declaration. Watch whether they speak to the IREV discrepancy issue or whether they speak past it. Second, APC will attempt to fold this into a narrative about NDC's unelectability. Expect statements from party spokespersons characterizing Obi as destabilizing, as undermining democratic institutions, precisely the framing I warned you about earlier. The intent is to shift the conversation from electoral integrity to Obi's temperament. Third, NDC will either move to build the ward-level infrastructure this declaration implies, or it will not. That is the fork. If, by the end of 2026, there is no evidence of systematic agent recruitment and training at the local government level, then the critics were right, and this was performance. If there is, watch the other parties respond. The signals to watch are INEC's 2027 election timetable, the National Assembly's posture on any proposed amendments to the Electoral Act, and the quiet movement of political finance, because money tells you where the serious bets are being placed. If the current trajectory holds, no accountability for 2023 irregularities, no structural reform of the collation process, and no credible independent monitoring framework, then 2027 will be litigated in the courts again. 3 years of presidential distraction, another cycle of democratic erosion, and a deeper question about whether Nigeria's federal structure can hold the weight of a contested presidency. The 12-month impact is political theater. The 3-year impact is institutional.
I asked you at the beginning, what does it mean that Peter Obi is saying this now, 2.5 years before the election? Here's the honest answer. It means the 2023 wound has not closed. It means NDC believes, and the tribunal record gives them grounds to believe, that the electoral system, as currently operating, will not deliver a result the party can accept on trust. And it means that the burden of proof going into 2027 sits squarely on INEC's credibility, not on any candidate's ambition. That is not NDC problem. That is a Nigerian democracy problem. The measured conclusion is this. Obi is right that parties should deploy robust parallel collation. He is right that the Electoral Act permits and in fact anticipates this. He will only be proven right about 2027 if NDC actually builds the infrastructure to execute it. And Nigeria will only move past this recurring crisis if INEC demonstrates, not declares, demonstrates that the law it operates under applies to every result it announces. I want to hear where you push back on this analysis. The comments are open. If I have missed something, say so, specifically and with evidence. That is how this conversation gets better. There is one thread I have not pulled yet, the question of what the 2027 opposition coalition actually looks like, whether NDC, PDP, and any third force movement find a common architecture, or whether they fracture again and hand the advantage back. That conversation is coming. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.